Welcome back. I am John P. Today we're going to be talking about some things that some watch sellers, some watch dealers will do that would seem unethical. I consider them to be unethical. And these are going to be kind of tricks of the trade, if you will, that have existed much before, we certainly started Delray Watch, where we buy, sell, trade watches. And that was kind of one of the things when we started Delray Watches. Federico and I, we wanted to, build a watch dealer, a watch company, a pre-owned watch company, where we would work with customers and clients much like ourselves as longtime watch collectors in the way that we wanted to. No tricks, no gotchas, nothing like that, and certainly aiming to be the most price competitive. And the thing is, today, the watch market is ultra competitive, and so some dealers do resort to kind of tricks, especially those that have not adopted technology and don't make content and maybe are more traditional brick and mortar retail. So I'm not singling anyone out, and these things are seemingly disappearing a little bit more every day as some of the old time watch dealers do kind of set sail into the retirement. So keep an eye out for these things. I think it would go a long way to keep an eye out and have them on your radar, but necessarily I wouldn't, get all up in arms and worried about it because it is becoming less common every day. So before we do that, on the wrist today, actually, very cool Omega Seamaster GMT. Some people call this kind of the equivalent of an Omega Explorer 2, but I swapped this out with Mickey hands. It's kind of funny. You can see more about this on my Instagram, The Real John P. So the first thing that happens sometimes to just be aware of, and this is going to happen a lot with vintage watches, especially vintage Rolex watches, this is going to be some dealers will remove links. Now, it can be difficult to know, but certainly if a watch is being advertised as new, it should have the amount of links that it was shipped with. Now, this is very common with gold because gold has serious value. And if someone wants to buy a Rolex watch particularly, or maybe an AP with a gold watch and they have a bigger wrist, that can really add up if they need extra links. So some dealers will remove the links and they'll save them up and they'll put them in a drawer for when they need them. And maybe they'll only give them to the customer with the amount of links that it fits. I mean, this can happen easily if you walk into a store somewhere. But keep in mind that when watches get older, people do misplace links. So if there are links that are missing for the amount of links that come shipped with the watch, it doesn't necessarily mean that the dealer took them out, especially if it's much older. The watch could have exchanged many hands or wrists at that point. So something to be aware of is to kind of make sure if the watch is going to fit you, but also keep your links when you buy a watch new because it could go a long way at making sure the watch is able to be worn by other people, which retains value for you should you go to trade or sell the watch. Now, the next thing that happens is there are many dealers today, especially during what happened with the pandemic, where there was this big influx of new collectors and people buying watches online. People are selling Rolex watches that they don't have. You can go on Chrono24 and there's thousands of Daytonas. There's thousands of subs, current gen, last gen, modern subs. There's thousands of these watches and sometimes the pictures look like they're duplicates. There's even a website out there that many watch dealers are upset with because they just steal your photos. They post them online. They post the watch for $20 cheaper so they have a better price and then they try to negotiate with the dealer if you make the sale. I won't say the name of the site, but that's something you have to be kind of on the watch for is, are these actually the pictures from the dealer? Now, a lot of dealers are really great at photography. We've done a lot of work to improve our pictures, but we still try to make sure that they don't look like stock photos because we want people to know that we have the watches in stock ready to ship and it could potentially ship the same day depending on when the order is placed. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure the dealer has the watch, and if the price is unbelievable, really ask them maybe for a quick little photo or something like that. And people ask us for this on Chrono24 sometimes and eBay, and we're usually glad to send them those pictures because we want people to be happy. So keep an eye out for people that are trying to sell watches they don't have to make a margin that never should have existed. The next thing to keep an eye out for is something called sliders. Now, this is going to be something I don't think many people have heard of, but kind of in the trade, you have something called a slider. Now, we sell these watches as unworn, and keep in mind, we don't buy a lot of wholesaler. We're working with everyone out there that we've been so fortunate and blessed to have with us, the fellow collectors at Delray Watch, but a lot of dealers do rely on this kind of a wholesale trade, much that you would find with, in the auto industry, when you have the, the different auto auctions and things like that. That does exist in parts of the world for watches, and you have these things called sliders, and essentially it's a watch that maybe someone wore for a couple times or a month, and some dealers out there will get some of these different brushing pads that are available out there, which is essentially like a glorified kind of sandpaper thing, and they'll kind of remove a couple little things here or there to make the brushing more consistent, and it'll be basically like someone tried it on the shop a few times, but that's kind of called a slider. But it really just depends. The dealer should know where the watch was or it was coming from to be able to kind of classify it in different conditions. And not always are dealers necessarily doing this to try to make a few extra dollars, because you have different platforms that have different condition ratings. It's something you have to keep in mind is, with the eBay, the Chrono 24, the Real, the First Dibs, all these platforms have a little bit of a different condition rating system, and none of them are basically the time zone rating system, which was probably the first one out there with the percentages. So these things can be a little bit subjective, I think, when it comes down to it. So, make sure to take a look at dealers' pictures. Conditions are nice, but take a look at the pictures. The picture should tell 1,000 words. This next one, I see a lot when watches have become competitive, especially Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Rolex. This is going to be advertising only the wire price. There are many dealers that will only accept wires. Now, I think many people, this will sound kind of shocking because we accept credit cards up to a certain dollar limit, a pretty high dollar limit, anything over 10,000, just according to an insurance policies that we have with our specialized e-commerce only insurance. We focus on wires or trade over that 10,000, depending on the circumstance. But many watch dealers will only put their wire price, especially at the less expensive watches. And then if you want to use a credit card, you got to tack on 3%. So sometimes, you'll have collectors that will kind of try to compare prices, and they'll say, this person is this price, this person is this price. What's the difference here? There could be many different differences that are taking place here: condition, provenance, box and papers, also just what they paid, what they had to take it in on. Did they have to take it in on trade? And so it's always good to know the payment method, because some banks will also charge wire fees, and it's different for everyone depending on their circumstances. Do you have treasury access for your circumstances to be able to send wires on the fly? Things like that. So make sure that the payment methods are being compared as well, because this is something I see all the time. Someone wants to use a credit card, and then there's like a 3% fee with that dealer. Something to keep an eye on and something to be aware of. The next one is calling replacement parts service parts. Now, this is a lot of times the case. If you send a Rolex watch into Rolex, they'll put service parts in the watch, and sometimes they'll put a lot of service parts in the watch. And this has changed over time, depends on the watch. This is always being adapted as well. They're changing depending on so many different things, and it also can depend on the brand as well. But generally, brands today really want their watches to be looking super nice, and they don't consider necessarily patina or ghost bezels or tropical dials to necessarily be looking nice from their perspective, right? I mean, they generally want their watches, and they have wanted their watches to look kind of new, and that's where polishing really came about. Decades ago, before it hurt the value of the watches. People wanted their watches to look closer to new than used before they became collector's items, and they were more jewelry statement / utility pieces. And so keep an eye on the service parts or the replacement parts. Sometimes that word is kind of used kind of loosely, but the service parts should be coming from the service center. There's some wiggle room in there, but generally that's what you need to look out for. So if it looks like a lot of different service parts, different year on the watch and things like that, keep in mind, but generally the prices are reflecting that. So if it's a rare or a vintage Rolex, for example, with service parts, it should be labeled as such, and the price should reflect this as well as compared to something that's all stock and original, even if there's more damage or scratches on those parts. And lastly, this one happens, but it really just kind of depends, and I don't think it matters a ton, but it's just something to be aware of, is kind of putting together sets, right? So it's very often that people will buy a watch and, maybe they're not a collector and they don't keep track of all the papers or the parts or the trinkets, like the submarine figures that come with some of the Panerai watches or things like that. Some watches come with a pen or a little figurine or a sculpture or an extra strap or a token that says, hey, Moonwatch NASA. something along those lines. And so sometimes people set those aside and then they sell or trade the watch, or maybe the watch, unfortunately, they lose it in some unfortunate series of events, or there's a theft or something. So they have these boxes, and then they'll sell the box and the trinkets. And then someone that maybe has a watch that, where they lost those things or it didn't come when they bought it pre-owned somewhere, then they'll kind of put together the sets. And this doesn't necessarily matter per se if there's nothing unique tying the watch to the set, but sometimes there is, right? When we're talking about limited editions, sometimes those numbers can carry over to the trinkets or the box, and sometimes the manual or the paperwork, and not necessarily with Rolex here. I mean, you do want to make sure that the papers match the watch and the serial numbers match up and everything is kosher in that regard. But sometimes with the trinkets, maybe they don't necessarily match up. And I've even seen, like I remember recently someone was selling to us an Omega watch and their papers just didn't match. The serial number was for a different watch. And so they swore that they bought this from an authorized dealer. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But nonetheless, even the authorized dealers can make mistakes and give you the wrong papers, for example. And that's something you should be aware of when you buy the watch, especially, at an authorized dealer. You're paying retail price. You deserve to get everything exactly how it comes from the factory when you're buying it brand new, authorized dealer boutique. So check all of that. And it's just something to be aware of. And I've seen especially the bigger ADs do this with even brands like Rolex, though things have changed, especially as the cards and the way that they handle the registration of these have changed. So what do we think, guys? Have you been aware of any of these? Have any of these things maybe you've picked up along the way? What do you think about them? I'd love to see it in the comments below, guys. Please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, trade watches. And you can find me on Instagram, The Real John P. We'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.